Well, hello. Welcome to this Bible study on behalf of the lifelong learning team of St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church in Barrie. My name is Keith Boyer, and I'm a member of that team, and I'm glad that we're able to share together in a study of the Scriptures and a study of one of the favorite stories of the Bible, the birth of Jesus. We will be meeting in 6 sessions. I invite you to move ahead with those sessions as you will. You might want to watch 2 or 3 at one sitting, or perhaps you will watch 1 a week. Whatever, it's up to you. But first of all, let me describe a few of the guidelines related to this study. To establish common ground, I want to mention 4 basic factors that are part of this particular study. The first is, this study will explore the birth of Jesus from several different perspectives. From a literary perspective, from a historical perspective, from a theological perspective. Sometimes they will merge, sometimes we'll consider them as separate items within the study. An important thing I need to mention is this study is not for those who believe that the Bible is the infallible and inerrant Word of God. If you are persuaded that is the case, this study will probably either result in you being anxious or angry, so you might want to simply pass this study by. On the other hand, this study is for those who have questions about the Bible and are comfortable considering them, who want to learn more about the background of the birth stories of Jesus, and are willing to be open in terms of considering the various ways in which they may be considered. And this study is for those of you who want to deepen your faith in God, and even more nurture your relationship with the risen Christ. If that sounds good to you, then we're good to go. So here's the study plan. In this session, we will have an introduction to the gospel witness related to the birth of Jesus. In session 2, we will explore the political, social, and religious context of Jesus' birth. In session 3, we will focus on the Gospel of Matthew and the stories of Joseph, the Magi, that is the wise men, and the star of Bethlehem. In session 4, we will look at the Gospel of Luke and how Mary played such an important role in that birth story, including a witness by angels and the visit of shepherds. In session 5, we will have an extended focus on what it means to claim that Jesus was born of a virgin. And in session 6, we will have a summary of the birth of Jesus' gospel witness. What does Christmas and its message mean for us in the living of our days? Now, there's one thing I want to say about myself as we begin this study, and that is, I agree with Dr. Peter Enns in his book, How the Bible Actually Works, in which he writes, there are 3 conspicuous yet often suppressed characteristics of the Bible. The Bible is ancient, the Bible is ambiguous, and the Bible is diverse. The Bible is ancient. Well, we all know that. We all know that the Bible was written millennia ago, and it reflects the mindset, the life experiences, the views regarding human beings' place in the universe from an ancient point of view. It's important that as we read the Bible, we embrace and recognize this characteristic of the Bible. It is ancient, and we read it as a work that is ancient. Secondly, we want to recognize that the Bible is ambiguous. That is, the Bible leaves it to us to work out the details of what it means to be a person of faith in our own time and context. There are observations the Bible makes about human beings and their relationship to God, but we are the ones who live that life these days. I want to be clear, the Bible is not a question and answer book, where if we say, well, what should we do in relation to this situation? Now I'll open the Bible and find a verse that will tell me. It just doesn't work that way. Thirdly, the Bible is diverse. That is, it does not speak with one voice on most subjects. We see that in the Bible's treatment regarding women. There are places in the Bible where women are treated as property. A father can treat or sell a daughter into slavery. There are places in the Bible where women are treated with great respect, where they're considered persons. The Bible is diverse in relationship to so many issues that are current in our time today. At the start of each session, I'm going to ask an "Have you ever wondered?" question. The question for today is, when reading some stories in the Bible, have you ever wondered, is this fact or fiction? Well, I think we all know that the Bible is a collection, a library of different kinds of writings. I know from my Sunday school days I was given a bookmark and it listed the books of the Bible and categorized them into history and prophecy and gospel and epistle or letters. I think we need to broaden that understanding of the Bible and use some other categories of descriptors. For example, words like legend and saga and myth and history or court records or oracles, prophecy, gospel, letters, fiction. There are different ways in which we can think of the Bible as we read it these days. For example, I would understand that there are stories in the book of Genesis which really fit in the category of legend or saga. And there are stories that are clearly written as fiction. In my mind, as I see it, the books of Jonah and Esther and Ruth and Job would fit in the category of fiction. You don't have to agree with me on that, but we do want to acknowledge that there are different types of writing in the Bible, and that it's okay that some of those writings may be essentially fiction. Virtually all the information we know about the life of Jesus is found in 4 Gospels. The 4 Gospels we know as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. You might not know that they were all written anonymously in the 1st century and did not gain their names until later in the 2nd century. And then in the 3rd and 4th centuries is when the church determined what authoritative writings would be in what we have come to know as the New Testament. So there was a long process of considering what writings ought to be in the New Testament and what ones ought not to be. In 1946, at Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a shepherd discovered a cache of writings that were written in Coptic. Coptic was Egyptian, the language of Egypt in the first century. They contained, among other things, some Gospels. The Gospel of Thomas, the Gospel of Philip, the Gospel of Truth. These Gospels were clearly making the rounds and are referred to, in fact, in some early church writings, but were not included in the New Testament and fell into disuse and then were lost for many years until discovered in 1946. In addition, there was a Gospel of Mary. Now that Mary refers to Mary Magdalene. And it was first discovered, or rediscovered, I guess we'd say, in the 19th century. And scraps of it, fragments of it have been found located in the 20th century. And it was also determined that they would not be included in the New Testament. In fact, what happened in the early church towards the end of the 2nd century was it was assumed that there would be 4 Gospels, 4 writings that would be considered authentic and would be placed in the New Testament. Other Gospels were dismissed. One of the reasons for this was found in the writings of Church Father Irenaeus. Irenaeus was reading in Ezekiel, and he read a description in which 4 became so prominent that he said, I'm pretty sure God is really leading us to understand that there ought to be just 4 Gospels. And that assumption stuck. So from that point on, the only issue was which of the many Gospels that were around would be selected to go into the New Testament. Another writing which will have some bearing perhaps related to our study on the birth of Jesus is called the Proto-Evangelium of James. It was written in the 2nd century, was well known, then disappeared and resurfaced in the 16th century. But we'll talk more about that at a later time. The story of Jesus' birth is found in 2 Gospels. The Gospels of Matthew, the Gospel of Luke. In comparison, the Gospel of Mark makes absolutely no reference to Jesus' birth. It begins with his baptism. The Gospel of John makes no reference to the birth of Jesus. Indeed, Jesus is introduced as the divine Word who pre-existed creation. In Matthew, we have a birth story featuring Joseph, the Magi, the star, and King Herod. In Luke, we have a birth story featuring Mary, 2 journeys to Bethlehem, an inn, the manger, and shepherds. Otherwise, in the New Testament, we find no references to Jesus' birth. The references to Jesus are related to his death and resurrection and its meaning. The question we might ask is, why do only 2 Gospels include the birth story of Jesus? There are a few answers to the question. Why do only 2 Gospels include birth stories? One possibility is that they were unknown to the other gospel writers. They just hadn't heard about any birth stories of Jesus and didn't feel the necessity to include them. Or they were known by the authors of Mark and John, but considered them not very important for the gospel story they wanted to tell. With this in mind, we should really note that the only reason the life of Jesus is noteworthy is because of his death and resurrection. That was the starting point. The starting point in the early church for the ministry or witness about Jesus was his death and resurrection. He's an adult. If there had been no death and resurrection, there would be no reason for anyone to be wanting to tell the story of Jesus. So we have an adult Jesus who dies, is raised, the church is formed, followers then meet to share that gospel, the meaning of the news of Christ's death and resurrection. And then they ask questions like, well, what else do we know about Jesus beyond death and resurrection? And the Gospels end up seeking to answer some of those questions. It's clear that Mark was content to simply tell the story of the adult Jesus, that is, from the point of his baptism. It's clear that John had a theological message he wanted to tell about the meaning of the person of Jesus, and it didn't really require any information about Jesus' childhood or birth. But Matthew and Luke had an interest in telling more of the story. But there might be another reason why the two Gospels didn't include any birth stories. That is, they knew the birth stories. Maybe they were circulating around at the time. Perhaps there were more than 2 birth stories, and they were uncertain about their accuracy or their authenticity, or were not persuaded that they were even important to tell. So there are several different reasons why we might consider only 2 of the Gospels contain birth stories of Jesus. Oh, now here I am in the middle between these 2 stories, one from Matthew and one from Luke. And I wanted to make it clear that what we've got here are 2 stories that are different when we have a look at them. Reminds me of 2 years ago, we had a Christmas presentation put on by the church school in which there were 2 youth who were assigned to create a Christmas pageant, and each was given one of the Gospels. And then they came together to compare notes and discovered it wasn't they had one story, they had 2 stories. But let's us take a look. Check out Matthew. Look at what is featured in Matthew. It's set in Bethlehem. If you simply get the Gospel of Matthew and read its story, you would say Mary and Joseph live in Bethlehem. Mary is a virgin. She's engaged to Joseph. The Lord speaks to Joseph in dreams. He's the featured actor in this story. He's told Mary is pregnant by the Holy Spirit. He marries Mary. Jesus is born. We're told that this all occurred when Herod was king in Jerusalem. And then we have the story of the wise men, the Magi, visitors from the east, who follow a star looking for a king of the Jews. The Magi go to King Herod, they discover that Bethlehem is where they ought to go, and they follow the star. It takes them right to the house, where they find in that house Mary, Joseph, and the baby. And they bring gifts, 3 gifts. And then they are warned in a dream to go home by another way, not to go home by way of Herod. Joseph's warned in a dream to flee, to take the family away. The family escapes to Egypt just in the nick of time because Herod sends soldiers to massacre all the infants in Bethlehem. And then the family who are in Egypt return from Egypt, learn that Herod's son is now on the throne, and because they're worried about him, they move north to Nazareth in Galilee. That's the Matthew story. Now the Luke story. Luke's story begins and is set in Nazareth. Mary is a virgin engaged to Joseph. The angel informs Mary this time. She's the key player in Luke. She will bear a child, and she is also told that her aging relative Elizabeth is pregnant. And Mary goes to visit Elizabeth in Judea, and there she sings a beautiful poem, the poem we now know as the Magnificat. And we are told that Elizabeth's child becomes John the Baptist, making Jesus and John relatives, probably cousins. We're told that Herod is king and Augustus is emperor of Rome. And due to a census, Mary and Joseph have to travel to Bethlehem in Judea. And there in Bethlehem, the baby is born. There's no place for them to stay. Their baby is placed in a manger. And then there's the wonderful story of angels appearing to shepherds out on the field. And the angels sing praise to God and tell the shepherds of what has happened in Bethlehem. And the shepherds race to the manger and worship. Praise God. Mary and Joseph stick around in Bethlehem long enough for the baby to be circumcised, which is normally on about the 7th day. And then they are around long enough that Mary also goes to the temple in Jerusalem for the ritual of her purification, which normally would be about 40 days. And then the family from Nazareth returns to Nazareth. Now you see the difference. Immediately we are struck by several things that are the same. Mary is a virgin engaged to Joseph. Jesus is born in Bethlehem. The time is at the time of Herod the king, and the family ends up at the end of both stories in Nazareth. But so much more is different. So much of this indicates we've got 2 stories going on here. 2 different stories about the birth of Jesus. There have been attempts to harmonize them. Indeed, I mentioned the Pro-Evangelium of James as a writing that has surfaced, and part of it was an attempt to harmonize the 2 birth stories. So certainly by the end of the 2nd century, there was a concern within the church, how do we bring these 2 clearly different stories into some form of harmonious relationship? Observing that Matthew and Luke offer 2 different stories of the birth of Jesus might lead you to ask the question, are there other examples of different versions of the same event in the Bible? And the answer is a clear yes. I'm going to give just a few examples. Take the story of creation in the first chapter of Genesis, a story we're well familiar with. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. It's one story of creation. It uses the word Elohim for God. In the second chapter, there's another story about the birth of creation and humankind, and it focuses on the name of God as Yahweh. It's clear there were two different creation stories, stories of beginnings that were circulating in ancient Israel. Or how about the number of animals on the ark in the story of Noah's Ark? Well, we're well familiar with the song, how they went in by twosies, twosies. Genesis chapter 6, 19 and 20. A pair of animals of every sort go on the ark. But then in the next chapter, in chapter 7 in Genesis, we're told that there were some pairs of animals that went in as 7 pairs. They were called the clean animals. They were clean animals because they could be used for sacrifice in the temple or following the time when Noah and his family got off the ark. That version of the story, most scholars think, was written by priests who worked in Jerusalem, who recognized we need some extra animals in relationship to the requirement for animal sacrifices. So let's have 7 pairs, not just a single pair. Or who killed Goliath? Well, we all know that story. The story of David and Goliath. The young boy David kills the giant Goliath. And that story is told in 1 Samuel chapter 17. The entire chapter, indeed, tells with great detail the events related to the killing of Goliath. It reads almost like a short story. But in 2 Samuel, there's another reference to the killing of Goliath. And there we're told a warrior named Elhanan was the person who defeated Goliath. Or let's just look at the genealogies that are given in Matthew and Luke, genealogies that both point to Joseph, even though the birth stories themselves do not signify Joseph as the father of Jesus, but the genealogies point to Joseph. One in Matthew traces Joseph's roots back to Abraham, and the other in Luke traces Joseph's roots back to Adam. But those two lists are different. Or, on what day did Jesus die? Well, most of the time, when we read the Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, we would say he was betrayed and died on the Passover. However, in the Gospel of John, he died the day before Passover. He was crucified on the day when lambs were being slaughtered in the temple on the day of preparation for the Passover. And the meal that was eaten in the Gospel of John was not the Passover meal, where it is in the other 3 Gospels. Different stories about the same event. Or, where did Paul go after his conversion? Wouldn't think that was important, but it seemed it was important for Paul. Because in the book of Acts, we're told Paul was converted, he stayed in Damascus, and then he escaped from Damascus, led over in a basket from a wall, and he went to Jerusalem, is what we're told in Acts. But in Paul's own writing, in his letter to the Galatians, he says, I want to make it really clear to you, when I left Damascus, I didn't go to Jerusalem. I went to Arabia and didn't go to Jerusalem till 3 years later. Indeed, he points out, he must have been aware there were some rumors going around that he had gone directly from Damascus to Jerusalem, and he wanted to correct that. He said, absolutely, and I'm not lying. I did not go to Jerusalem. I went to Arabia. Two different versions of the same event. So to summarize, just as in the Bible there are different stories describing the same event, so it is true for the birth of Jesus. There are two gospel stories containing the birth of Jesus narrative, the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. In many ways, those stories are different, and they're difficult to harmonize. And this was even observed in the 2nd century, when scholars of that time sought to work out how do we bring these two stories together. But we do want to point out that both stories agree on several points. They agree that Mary and Joseph are Jesus' earthly parents. They agree that Mary was a virgin. They agree that Jesus was born in Bethlehem of Judea, and in the time when Herod was king. And both stories end with the family being in Nazareth in Galilee. Well, here's your assignment before the next session. Read both stories from Matthew and Luke and make a list of the differences that you note that are unique to either Matthew or Luke. Make your own list from your own reading, and I'll see you next time.